This video contains full spoilers for Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1, as well as the entirety of the Tomorrowverse. The Tomorrowverse has been a bit of a hit and miss franchise for me, and they really hadn't been given enough time to properly build up to Crisis on Infinite Earths. Combine that with the immediate previous movie in the franchise being by far its worst, and I was very apprehensive for this animated trilogy adaptation of Crisis on Infinite Earths, as I should be. Initially, I didn't think my worries were unwarranted, but I'm happy to say that by the end of the movie, I pretty much completely flipped on that. It's pretty damn good and maybe the best movie in the Tomorrowverse. This video will be my review for Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1. Now, first and foremost, while this movie certainly features a lot of heroes, this is primarily a Flash movie, and a very unique one at that. Part 1 throws us right into the middle of a certain event that the Flash is going through, and literally the entire movie technically takes place within that event, that being, he was sent out of linear time and has been living certain events of his life over again, all while living in a Flash time-like state for decades with Iris, trying to complete the Quantum Towers. This is essentially the main premise of the movie, but we don't actually quite know that for a little while. We're slowly, over time, given tidbits of information regarding what Barry is going through. Initially, I was a bit confused, maybe not even understanding what's happening, but as we got every tidbit of information, the picture became more and more clear, which in turn also made me rethink my perspective on the movie up until this point. Barry living out his days with Iris in Flash time while jumping in and out of linearity was simply an extraordinarily effective twist, one that made perfect sense with what the movie has presented up until this point, one that made the rest of the movie better than it initially was, and one that kind of makes for a beautiful love story, allowing Barry and Iris to live to old age together, separated entirely from time, while also then adapting Barry's death from the original comic, in such a way, in fact, that's a lot more final. It's not necessarily as effective visually as Barry's death in the comic, but it is maybe a bit more poetic. It was a fantastic idea to take the biggest death in the Crisis and dedicate the entire movie to just that, and to that character, making the Flash the main character. It made for a really bittersweet story that ended in a very satisfying conclusion and effective death. That's not the only twist of the movie, there's several. Harbinger is revealed to be Supergirl, not Lila Michaels like in the comics, which was a very surprising reveal, one that I'd wait until part 2 to pass judgment on because I have no idea why they did that, and it doesn't really have a bearing on this movie, but certainly on part 2 where I think Supergirl will be the main character. What I don't get is why the only Legionnaire other than Kara to be brought to the Monitor ship was Dawnstar, when she vanished alongside the rest of them anyway. Why her specifically? The more part 1 relevant twist is that the homeless man guiding Barry through his non-linear adventure is none other than John Constantine, continuing and officially canonizing into the Tomorrowverse the events of Constantine House of Mystery, which in turn confirms that the Tomorrowverse is indeed what we thought it was, the official continuation to the DCAMU, further solidified by the appearance of the Spectre, voiced by the same actor, and his mention that Barry is partially responsible for these events, unpacking all of that. First of all, the reveal that the homeless man is John Constantine was really great. The yellow magic and accent certainly made me think Constantine, but it also made me maybe think Dr. Fate, but also the facial hair suggested that it was not John Constantine, but it was, and John Constantine being the pariah replacement is, I think, a really creative and very fitting idea, and honestly, there's no better way to put it than this. It's just so cool to me that they kept this storyline going, that they committed to the Tomorrowverse being a DCAMU sequel. It makes me feel rewarded for having following the DCAMU and now the Tomorrowverse this entire time. I'm so glad they stuck to it. It also works extremely well for Barry, as this movie explains my big question from Constantine House of Mystery, which is why was it only Constantine who was punished and not Barry, who was maybe even more responsible for changing the timeline, certainly the first time around. As it turns out, the universe seemingly saw it fit to punish him in such a way that led to his sacrifice here, in such a way that saves the multiverse while allowing Barry to live a relatively happy life with Iris. So in the end, it wasn't really all that big of a punishment, especially compared to Constantine. Though this movie solidified the story for me, I was always interested in it, but I was worried that they either wouldn't go through with it or maybe ruin it. But at least for now, they have absolutely done it justice, and I can't wait to see what they do with Constantine going forward. The non-linearity of this movie felt very inspired by Christopher Nolan movies. That is to say that it maybe was a bit confusing at times, but also once you get to the end, it all becomes a clear picture, which is true for most Christopher Nolan movies, and it makes for a very unique experience for a superhero movie, deviating tremendously from the typical superhero movie structure, and genuinely pulling it off by the end, while while also allowing the Tomorrowverse to maybe fill in some gaps in the past, like the formation of the Justice League, which connects directly to the end credit scene from The Long Halloween, Barry and Iris meeting, and then also their wedding, which takes place around the same time as Justice League Warworld. Like Justice League Dark Apocalypse War before it, this movie made the universe feel more complete and connected, while making the timeline a bit more confusing, if I'm being honest. Like, Barry and Iris got engaged during the events of Justice Society World War II, which takes place before the Justice League's formation, but by the time they get married, it's the most recent event in the universe, and Jon Stewart is Barry's best man. Green Lantern Beware My Power takes place at least 2 years after the formation of the Justice League, because Hal Jordan appears there, and it's said that he's missing for 2 years during that movie. And then enough time has to pass after that for Barry and Jon to become really good friends, because they had never met before, which means I would say Barry and Iris's engagement lasted at least like 3 years, which is, I guess, something that could be a possibility, but it's a bit much. Speaking of Hal Jordan, I really don't like what they did with him in this movie. The fact that he appears but then refuses to join the League. I mean, this was their one and only chance to show Hal as Green Lantern in action. That was very, very disappointing. I don't know why this universe hates Hal Jordan so much. The League's forming was relatively well handled, being done in a bit of an unconventional way, mostly as just an idea that Flash has that they all agreed to. That's not something they would make an actual movie about, but it does fit the non-linearity of this movie, as the fight with the Amazo and his presence connects directly to the present day. Their first fight is against Amazo and Lex Luthor. Now, I will say Luthor's appearance I did not care for. His design just looks like Metallo was an out-of-place CGI model, and at one point became way larger for a few seconds for no reason and with no explanation, and then his dialogue was also nothing special. Amazo, on the other hand, clearly, like a lot of this universe, inspired by the DCAU version, was a really cool character. Nothing about him, whether that be his design, voice acting, his story, or dialogue, reached the peaks that the DCAU version did, but that is basically an impossible level to reach, and this is still a pretty fantastic character. With one of the better Amazo designs, his inner conflict with his own conflicting programming was handled really well, and I especially like the scene of him using his speed abilities to secretly help the Flash while actively fighting the Justice League at the same time. Beyond that, Amazo was one of the better uses of the non-linear storytelling in this movie, like I already mentioned. Periodically returning to his story, Amazo's inner conflict from that day is rewarded when an old man Barry Allen uses him to save the world, and multiple worlds at that, allowing him to achieve his primary function. I really didn't expect such complex storytelling from this movie and from Amazo, but I do definitely think that the movie landed there and justified having the non-linear storytelling and specifically focusing on the day that the Justice League formed and the Amazo conflict, because again, it connected directly into the Crisis story in the present day. Backing up a bit, this movie introduces many characters from the crime syndicate of Earth 3 to the expanded JSA of Earth 2 to the heroes of Earth 4, X, S, and 146. The sheer amount of characters who appear here is a bit staggering, and it's pretty impressive how they not only included all these uniquely designed characters in so many different shots, but also how they do that with the whole movie not feeling like a slideshow of introducing new characters, because seriously, this movie has like 100 heroes, but Barry Allen is the one and only character who takes absolute center stage. Now yes, a lot of it is just these characters standing in the background, not really moving, looking like just an image, but I do think that with the budget that they have here, they did the best that they could, and a surprisingly large number of new heroes get lines like Mr. Terrific, Blue Beetle, Huntress, Robin, Question, Aquaman, Hawkman, Dr. Light, all acting in character. Dr. Light is exceedingly annoying, just like in the comics. The Question talks like a 1950s radio announcer, and it's awesome. Hawkman has one line and is portrayed so clearly as the Thanagarian version as opposed to Carter Hall, while both Robin and Huntress are given really genuine and effective very short scenes with Batman, as it's revealed that Dick Grayson never becomes Robin on Earth 1, and Earth 2 Batman died years ago alongside Catwoman. Some of the previously introduced heroes, like the entire Justice League, Earth 2 Superman, Wonder Woman, and Black Canary, all get lines as well. The two Supermen have this really nice scene talking about Lois and Diana, and I don't mind at all that Wonder Woman and Superman of Earth 2 are together, because it makes sense that as all the JSA are that old now, that Lois Lane probably isn't around anymore. Now this particular issue is definitely not perfect. A lot of characters just stand in the background never talking, and it feels like a lot of characters should have had lines. Like Jay Garrick or Hourman should have interacted with Barry, Speedy and Green Arrow should have interacted, definitely Superman and Supergirl. It's weird that they didn't have any lines with each other at all, but for the most part, I was mostly impressed by the balance they struck between the sheer number of characters being introduced and on screen at any given same time, and the clear focus they put on the character and story above all else. Oh, one thing also about the characters in this movie is that it is revealed that Diana from Justice League Warworld is the Earth 2 version, like I thought. But the Earth 1 version never appears and seemingly doesn't even exist, despite the fact that she was mentioned in Green Lantern Beware My Power, which is maybe something that the producers of this movie just forgot about. The Crime Syndicate have some of the funniest lines and moments in the movie, derived from how blatantly and cartoonishly evil they are, calling their HQ the Hall of Evil, saying their world sucks, stopping a building from falling on their statues just to let it fall to the other side. The Crime Syndicate genuinely made me laugh multiple times, but then a bit of nuance is inserted as they fight and sacrifice their own lives to attempt to save their world, as Owlman gives his first and final badass line and goes off to sacrifice his life as well. What they did here with the Crime Syndicate is nothing incredible or anything, and never reaches the heights of Owlman in Justice League Crisis on Two Earths. But there is some very memorable lines and moments, some comedy and some nuance in a movie with an insanely large amount of characters. I think they developed these characters really well in the short amount of time that they had. On the technical side, I think it's pretty clear they put a bit more effort and probably budget into this one than most, if not all, Tomorrowverse movies, but they definitely still have a bit of a small budget, maybe a smaller one than they needed, because again, like I mentioned earlier, while there is a lot of characters, and for the most part it's impressive how they pulled that off, they do a lot of the time just kind of stick to the background. But there is at times some really fantastic visuals and animation, which remain at a pretty consistent high quality throughout with minimal exception, and the really good voice acting, especially from Matt Bomer, who does a really fantastic job as Barry Allen. There's also not much of that Tomorrowverse production issue where characters pause for a very long time for some reason. This movie only had like 1 or 2 of those moments. Those moments are certainly very noticeable, but also very few and far between. None of those moments would be preferable, like the Long Halloween movies, but I guess 1 or 2 is fine. Also, the music was good. Again, not necessarily anything absolutely epic or memorable, but certainly used exactly as it should, which is not always the case for these low-budget movies. So for a lot of it, I think they had the budget to reach what they needed to do. For other parts of it, maybe not, while other parts I did think they did a pretty fantastic job, like with especially the visuals and voice acting. Fitting the non-linear theme of the movie, I'll be ending this review off right in the beginning with the intro, which I thought was just really cool. It reminded me of the intro from Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths or the DCEU movie intro, and I think it was a pretty cool one that set the stage for this movie right from the beginning to be maybe the best Tomorrowverse movie, because if I remember correctly, I don't think any of the other Tomorrowverse movies have an intro like this one. So yeah, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 was a surprisingly great first part to the trilogy, which tells an effective non-linear story balancing its Barry Allen character focus with the impressively tremendous stakes and amount of characters in a story filled with twists and turns, great animation, visuals, and voice acting, and a beautiful love story that comes to a satisfying conclusion, adapting one of the most impactful deaths in comics, while making the universe feel a bit more connected, continuing a story that's been set up for years. Sure, it is a bit of a slow burn, can be confusing at times, does muddle the timeline a bit, doesn't use 100% of its characters well, and there are moments that feel cheap production-wise, but I really cannot, for the most part, complain about what we got here. I'd give Part 1 an 8 out of 10, giving The Long Halloween a run for its money for Best Tomorrowverse Movie. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below about what you thought about Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1. What was your favorite moment? Maybe something that you didn't like, or something that you disagree or agree with about my review. And what are you excited about for Part 2?